Hey there, welcome again to Books on World Mythology. Um, I like this video to be a bit of a follow-up to two other videos I did. There was the one I did on Greek and Roman books, mythology books 101, and another one I did on Norse mythology books 101. I just wanted to add a couple more books and make a few more clarifications about some things. Okay, first, classical mythology. Last time I talked about books that they were general books on the myths of Greece and Rome, and then I went into English translations of the originals, and I thought if anybody wondered, I forgot to mention this other book, that if anybody wondered what kind of textbook can I read on the subject, a book that really goes into the versions of the myths, some translation mixed in there, the meaning of the gods, and there's this really good book. It takes a god by god approach. It's simply called Classical Mythology, and I actually used this textbook in a college course I took on the subject. And it's by two authors. It's Morford and Lenardin. Classical Mythology, very helpful, very thorough. I recommend that. And also, there's another book that, it's kind of a hidden secret. I don't know why any teacher didn't tell me about this book. What happens that, at the end of the Iliad, after Hector dies and he's buried, and then it just ends, and if you ever wondered, well, what the heck happened? Where's the horse I keep hearing about? Who won? What happened to Achilles? Well, basically, there is another whole other epic that was written about 1,000 years after Homer. It's written in ancient Greek. It was written by a guy who really tried to emulate Homer. And a lot of people complain it's, of course, not as good as Homer, but so what? It's got all this. It's got all the missing stuff, and it's this book right here. It was written. It was written by a guy called around the 3rd century A.D. called Quintus of Smyrna. Quintus of Smyrna, and it's simply called The Fall of Troy. Other versions is called the Trojan Epic. That's another version I saw in translation. Sometimes this book is called Post-Homerica because it's all the stuff after Homer, Post-Homerica. And this particular translation, there's a few others, but this particular one is by Bakewell. Right down here, Bakewell. So Quintus of Smyrna gave us this great book. It takes up the story after the death of the death of Hector. It goes into further fighting, the death of Achilles, the Trojan horse, and some stuff after that, the fall of Troy, and all that. So yeah, of course, Book 2 of the Aeneid by Virgil has a lot of stuff that happens about the Trojan War. But if you want a whole nother epic, that's this book. And it's actually a very good book. Okay, now getting into Norse Germanic mythology. Last time I had mentioned a very important book, the Saga of the Volsungs. This is the edition I showed you by Anderson. I wanted to, what I didn't mention was I mentioned that, you may not find this very old one, and I had suggested their public domain version, but sometimes public domain versions, they're old translations, sometimes they're not as good. I neglected to mention that there's a really, really modern English translation of the Saga of the Volsungs, the subtitle, The Norse Epic of Sigurd, the Dragon Slayer, and this translation is by a very noted scholar. He's translated several books, Jesse L. Byock, B-Y-O-C-K, Jesse L. Byock, and this is a pretty up-to-date translation. If you like this translation, this guy also has an English translation of another book I mentioned in the video, the Saga of Rolf Kraki, also known as Rolf and his champions. So this is really great. This is a must. This book. It's as well as the German version of the story. This is got it upside down. The Nibelungenlied, the Song of the Nibelungs, which I mentioned in my other videos. They're both based on the same story, but they're very, very different in details. They're both written around the 13th century A.D. This is the Icelandic version. It's in prose. This is the German-Austrian version. It's in verse. Although this translation is in prose. It's funny that the complex of historical events that led up to these stories. Oh, before I forget, let me mention that the Icelandic version is still very pagan. Odin plays an important role in what goes on. In this book, in the Austrian version, they're all Christian, basically. But if you look carefully, there's some pagan elements here and there. And it's so interesting about the complex of slight, little historical events that happened that created the mythological complex that grew up around certain historical events. For example, in around the 5th century A.D., there was when a lot of the Germanic peoples were coming into Roman territory. There was a Germanic, and the Germans themselves were fighting with other people, especially the Huns. There was a Germanic tribe called the Burgundians, and the Burgundians are definitely mentioned in this book here. The Burgundians. The Burgundians were real people. They had a center. Their center was around Worms in Germany, and they were attacked and destroyed by the Huns in a fight. And the main character, the leader went by the name of Gundaharius, or Gundahar, I believe. And there's a character in this book called Gunther, and then he's called Gunnar, and they're based on that guy, and they're based on the destruction. They're based on that real fight that happened in the 5th century A.D. The Burgundians then, after they were defeated, they left Worms and they settled in modern day France, which is why there's a section of France called Burgundy. Okay. Another thing about, I didn't mention it, but even though this is a very famous translation, some people feel that, well, the story's originally in verse. I'd love to read a verse translation. There is this absolutely wonderful translation in verse by a great translator that I've read several of his translations. His name was Burton Raffel, right down here, Burton Raffel, and it's Das Nibelungenlied, and the Song of the Nibelungs. And so if you insist on getting a verse translation, this I really enjoyed. And I'm going to backtrack again and get back to Greek and Roman mythology. I forgot about these two books. In my previous video, I talked about Euripides and I held up this book. And then when I talked about Euripides again, I held up this book. Might have confused you a little bit. Basically, there's a lot of single volume editions with Euripides plays. He left us about 19. That at least those are the ones that survived. Usually in these little paperback versions, that you won't find all of them, but you'll find like around 10, and they're usually some of the best ones he's got. It doesn't matter which one you get because they tend to. I found these both really good. This one is 10 plays translated by Paul Roach, and it's put out by Signet Classics, and this one is another one, 10 plays by Euripides, and this one is translated by Moses Hadas, and John McLean, and this one is put out by Bantam, and they both have like some of my favorite stories in here. Alcestis, Medea, the Bacchants, also known as the Bacchae. The Bacchae, those two I really like. And let me just make sure this one, I don't want to steer you wrong. Alcestis, Medea, and the Bacchae. Those are my three favorites there in both books. But those are my three favorites at least. But they're all pretty good. Okay, so that's all I have to say in this video. Thank you for joining me. And until next time, happy reading.